Today's topic is Strangers and Angels Unaware. Bill Millar is the facilitator of today's webinar. Welcome, Bill. Before I turn over to Bill, I would like to give you a few comments. First, I would like to thank you for giving us permission to record this webinar. Second, those who have joined through computer or tablets, I have turned off your video and muted your microphone when you join the webinar. I turn off your video because we would like to use the screen mostly for the facilitator. When we break into small groups, please turn on your video. And when you share, please unmute yourself. And when you're done speaking, please mute your microphone. When we are back to the large group, turn off your video. If not, I will turn it off for you. When the facilitator asks you questions or comments, please write them down in the chat box. If you are joining us through phone, we will unmute you when you return to a large group. Lastly, if you have a technical issue, send me or Nicole Rokas a private message. Nicole is our communications coordinator. Okay, to briefly introduce Bill, he is an intercultural ministry researcher and trainer. Prior to this, he was a pastor of Knox United in Winnipeg. Welcome, Bill.
Good, thanks. Is that okay? We've got audio. Can you hear me? Are we okay? Good. Wow. Hi. I am speaking to you from Treaty 1 land, just a few kilometers from Nistawayak, the junction of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers, where for many centuries, long before Chaucer even thought of writing the Canterbury Tales, nations would meet. It's been a sacred place for trade and for treaties, a place where not only rivers, but differing peoples met and found common ground. And it's a place where currently it is something like -42 with the wind chill. I've read through the registrations. I know a few of you. Most I don't. One phrase from one registration really struck a chord. The writer said she was looking for tools for discerning the diversity right in front of our eyes. It's a perfect description of what I hope will happen too. All things going well. This, Jonathan, can we bring that up? I'm not seeing that on the PowerPoint. Coming to slide number 3. And next one over. There we go. This is a finely tuned process. And that we're seeing, Pablo, we're seeing the actual whole desktop there. There we go. All things going well. That is something of the landscape that I hope we will cover this afternoon. We'll begin with cognition, and really that's looking at an awareness of our current situation that can lead us into recognition, an awareness of the possibilities that surround us. We've had over 80 people register. I'm not sure how many are online. But while we can break into groups, and well, Pablo can break us into groups, I won't even try to. Unfortunately, with just an hour, direct feedback from the groups will not really be possible. So please write your thoughts, your comments, and your questions using that chat box at the bottom of your screen. And I will gather these and try to respond to all of them within the coming week in a group email, so we can still honor the whole group's participation. Next. So I want to begin with a bit of worship. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Many of you will know this scripture, love this scripture. I wanted to focus on this phrase, hospitality to strangers, which in Greek is one word, philoxenias. And that in turn is a compound of two Greek words, xenos, stranger, and philia, love of or kindness to, welcoming. It is the love of a stranger and therefore the literal opposite of xenophobia, the fear of the stranger. So understanding some ways that how we can move from xenophobia to xenophilia is a part of what I hope we can do today. I want to invite you to take a minute and in the quiet, think of your own faith community and how the fear of the stranger, the different one, touches your community and what deeply loving the stranger, xenophilia, might look like. What might change for you? Allow those images to form. And so these images become our prayer, living God. We gather them scattered as they are across this land into our own clumsy arms and lift them to you. Open our hearts, open our minds, open our loves, we pray. Amen. Canada has been changing for some time. And the Canada that is emerging will be conspicuously different than it was, no longer dominated by a white European majority. It will either be a society of interactive circles where diverse cultures both maintain and interconnect, or perhaps it will be a strained, polarized country of small cohorts and ethnic communities in silos. And it is we who will decide. Next. And this might be the most important church development and planning document produced in decades. Yet, oddly, it is overlooked by most denominations. It was produced by Statistics Canada, and they blessed it with the inspirational title, Immigration and Diversity. Population projections for Canada and its regions, 2011 to 2036. Stand in line at Costco. Go to a downtown food court. Throughout many of our cities, you can see this Canada, this new Canada that is emerging. In Mississauga today, with a population of just over 750,000, over half, 54% are from Asia, immigrants. In Burnaby, 73%, just under 3/4 of the population are visible minority. That's basically 3 times the white population. In Calgary, in the northeast corner, in the Rundle neighborhood, every second person is an immigrant. I want you to use your imagination for a moment and just see the faces in your congregation. What do you notice? Scan them. A few years ago at the Winnipeg Folk Festival, when the Sierra Leonean All-Stars were on stage, they were joined by Sally Waya, a good friend who is also from Sierra Leone. Maybe 40,000 people watching. Afterwards, Sally said to me, "Bill, I have never seen so many white people together in one place at the same time. It was like snow on the hill, Bill, snow on the hill." Well, that might not be everyone's experience of church, but it might be yours. And I want to invite you to keep returning to this image of your congregation as we go through this. To understand the population shifts, we need to look at population growth. For most of the 20th century, Canada's population grew through what Stats Can calls natural increase, having babies. Now, I just have to get my little thing to move down there. Hold on. There we go. good citizens having sex and producing babies was everybody assumed the way the population would increase. And for most of our history, it worked. Then in the 1960s, Canadians, now largely urban, didn't need large families and corporately decided to have fewer babies. So few, in fact, that fertility levels would fall below replacement levels. That happened in 1972. That rate continued to fall below 1.8 in 1976, below 1.7 in 1993. A sea change had occurred. Incidentally, this decline in birth rate was one of the social factors that led Margaret Atwood to imagine Gilead when she wrote The Handmaid's Tale in the 80s. That time she said, in societies in which the birth rate goes plummeting down below replacement, the society has two choices. It can gently slide into oblivion and vanish from the face of the earth, or it can control birth. Surprisingly, perhaps, Canada came up with a third option. By the late 1990s, immigrants moving here had become the main source for population growth in Canada. Immigration flows to Canada were among the highest of all Western nations. Between 2001 and 2011, 2/3 of Canada's growth came from immigration, 2/3. Now, in the past, almost 80% of the immigrants were from Christian, white Europe. Most recently, Europeans accounted for only 14% of the immigrants, another sea change. Now the primary source for our population's replacement and growth are folk who are non-white, non-European, from Asia mostly, but also many from Africa. In 2016, about 22% of Canadians were foreign-born and have come here as immigrants. In Toronto, 46%, almost half, are immigrants. Calgary, 29%. Just under 1 in 4 people living in Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Ottawa have emigrated here. And because most immigrants today come from Asia or Africa, we need to talk about a topic that makes many liberal-minded social progressives twitch a bit. Like that. Color, race. Of course, race is implicit in the demographic changes. On the basis of physical appearance alone, for example, facial characteristics, it's hard to distinguish a Londoner from a Latvian. In the emerging Canada, the hues are broadening, skin color changing. Now, skin tone is but one measure of race. Race is more than hue. It is culture and history. It is where your people were in the heyday of colonialism. It's how you understand yourself in the world. It is language and story and lament and song and much more. But it's also about color. StatsCan uses the term visible minority. Others use words like racialized or people of color. Currently, 51.4% of people living in Toronto are visible minority. There, the minority are, in fact, the majority, and the majority, the minority. 49% of people living in Vancouver are visible minority, 25% of Ottawa, 26% of Winnipeg, 28% of Edmonton, 34% of Calgary. Across the country, about 22.3% of us are so-called visible minority. That's about 1 in 4 Canadians. And this doesn't include what Statistics Canada calls Aboriginal identity, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Across Canada, just over 2 million of us, or about 6%, are Indigenous. Higher in the prairies, 12% in Manitoba, 16% in Saskatchewan. Add them into the cultural mix and, well, today, in a few Canadian cities, there are already more brown or black people than white. Burnaby, for example, Toronto. But in many places, there are many, many places in which nearly half are people of color. Next. You can see some of these things. This looks at the projections for Canada. Now, while parts of this study are kind of technical, they lost me, the basics are simple. They use census data, present and past, to provide projections into the future. They use two projections, a high immigration and a low immigration one. For ease, I'll just use the midpoint between the two. In Toronto, in 2036, well over the half the population will be immigrants. If we include children of these immigrants, almost 80% of the city's population will be newcomer. 4 out of 5 Torontonians. In Vancouver, 7 out of 10. Calgary, 6 out of 10. In Winnipeg, my hometown, 1 in 3 will be newcomers. If we include their children, over half, 54%, will be newcomer. Montreal, Edmonton, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, all will have over half their populations immigrant or child of an immigrant. By 2036, they estimate that over 60% of the immigrants will be from Asia and over 10% from Africa. Less than 1 out of every 6 will be from Europe. It's a complete reversal of the past. Race is a sensitive topic. Some say they don't see it. Well, it might be true if the speaker's a child, but if adults who say this are almost always white. Not seeing race is one of the apparent perks of being in the majority. You don't have to. It has not been an issue for them. But if we listen to the experiences of others, or if we ourselves are people of color and can draw on our own experience, race matters. And our country's racial character is changing. StatsCan in that study predicts that in 2036, well over 1 out of every 3 Canadians will be visible minority. 40% of our children in schools will be visible minority. 40% of all babies born here. 39% of the workforce. Again, we see the strongest in the cities. 68% of people living in Toronto will be visible minority. 64% of Vancouverites. Just over half of Calgary will be visible minority. That means that half will look more like their current mayor than their premier. Imagine walking on the streets of Edmonton, Montreal, Ottawa, Windsor, Regina, the Queen City itself, Kitchener, Waterloo, and Saskatoon. In all these communities, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the folk who are on the streets will be people of color. Projections for the Indigenous populations can be found in a separate document by StatsCan, but those numbers vary across the country. But for example, they estimate that 1 out of 5 Manitobans will be First Nations, 1 out of 6 Winnipeggers. Taken together, this means that in my hometown, 16 years from now, about 2/3 of the population will be brown or black. An intriguing mix of those who have been here for millennia and those who have just arrived. The settlers will be only about 1/3 of the community. John Ralston Saul says that European settlers, unable to build roads across this vast land, were forced initially to accommodate rather than dominate. And so it was from the Indigenous populations that the Canadian concept of enlarging the circle emerged. Will we continue to enlarge the circle? Or now that the information superhighway does not depend on physical roads, will we abandon that core concept? Next. How will our churches respond to this increasing diversity in the neighborhoods? Will we welcome and engage those who come with different accents and hues, different names and faces? What happens if we choose not to? Historically, churches have been integral to our national identity and character. They influence Canadian social trends, and Canadian social trends influence them. Our growth patterns, for example, closely resembled each other. Next. I'll use the United Church as an example. Like the country, it grew slowly from its birth in 1925 to its peak population in the mid-60s when it had well over 1 million members. That growth pattern closely mirrored Canada's. A few came through immigration, remember, European Christians, but overwhelmingly most came through members having babies, baptizing them, bringing them to Sunday school. Eventually they joined the church. Oh, maybe they'd stop attending for a while, but they'd start again once they started having their own babies. That's the pattern we knew, the one we came to expect. Perhaps you recognize this pattern. Shortly after I'm sorry, I've just lost my little thing. There we go. Shortly after we peaked in the mid-60s, we began to shrink. That's also when the Canadian birth rate began to decline. And curiously enough, when the birth control pill was coming into use, we were reflecting the Canadian pattern, except for that immigration thing. We kept assuming we would continue to grow, or at least maintain the same way as we grew or maintained before, through babies. But as the congregations aged and the birth rate dropped below replacement levels, that wasn't going to happen. New initiatives, programs, and even the best gimmicks didn't seem to help. That gentle slide, inevitable or not, was and is dramatic. You probably heard about the Anglican study that if current patterns of decline continue, there'll be no members, attenders, or givers in the Anglican Church in the year 2040. 0. Next. That caused me to look at the United Church. Turns out we're a little ahead of the Anglicans. Average attendance at worship, you can see that in the orange line there, has shown a consistent pattern of decline for 30 years. If that continues, somewhere between the years 2032 and 2034, no one will be attending worship in the United Church. Not one person. That means based solely on worship attendance, our life expectancy at this point is about 12 to 14 years. Then I looked at the total membership in the United Church, and here we're walking hand in hand with the Anglicans. According to my projections, we're going to run out of members around 2042, just over 20 years from now. So what does this mean? It sounds pretty apocalyptic. Remember, though, that the role of apocalyptic is to be scary. It's trying to say to you, to all of us, wake up. It's like the global warming scenarios. Wake up. You love this planet. You love its biodiversity. So wake up. You love this church, this faith. So wake up. There's a rough parallel between climate change in relation to political systems and demographic change in relation to the church. If we keep going the same direction, in both cases, we'll end up destroying ourselves, gently or not so gently, slide into oblivion. So, should we consider changing direction? If the country's population growth is almost entirely coming from immigration, non-European, non-white, non-Western, is there any reason to believe that our growth as a church, any growth, would show a different pattern? Next. If we love our churches, and I confess I really do love the United Church, then do we even have the right to let it, in Atwood's words, gently slide into oblivion? Simply because allowing newcomers, foreigners, in might make us feel uncomfortable, might cause us to change. What if we really have only two choices? To embrace this new reality, allowing and encouraging our churches to morph into new intercultural communities, or become a kind of Anglo hideout, hold on as long as we can, last refuge of the once dominant colonialists. What do we do? And I'm going to invite you into groups. Pablo will make that happen, and to have a few moments of conversation. Sure. There was a comment that was interesting. It says, when the percentage shifts, will the visible minority still be minority, or will they be majority? And one of the interesting pieces in that is that majority is more than just numbers, isn't it? It has to do with access to the central way a society runs, the central heart, so that you can still be marginalized even if there is a large group of people, larger than the people who are marginalizing. So it is an interesting thing. The changes that are external have to be accompanied by internal changes for us to really become, I think, the society that I think we're being called to become. There isn't a lot of time in terms of the feedback, and I'm sorry for that. I hope that you will use the chat things, because I do make a commitment that I will try to respond to any questions and respond to all comments within the coming week, and we'll do it as a sort of a group email that goes out. And if it's okay, I feel a bit bad, but if it's okay, I think we might just kind of move on and trust that. I hope that you've had good conversations in your groups. Can we move forward a little bit? Yeah, to the next one. Okay. To paraphrase Esther 4:14, if you turn away from such a moment and remain silent, it's true, deliverance may indeed come from another source, but you and your house, your community, may perish. Who knows? Perhaps you were put in your position for a moment just like this. I have a bias. I am utterly convinced that this moment is indeed a holy moment, filled with opportunities that we haven't seen before. In this moment when so many of us in the church can no longer cling to what was and can be no more, there's great hope, and it lies in creating intentionally open communities, intercultural, interracial, intersectional. And of course, this is our deepest tradition, isn't it? For the church was born as an intentionally open community. For there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. It couldn't have been very comfortable for those first century Jewish followers. And bad enough they had to open their hearts and their communities to semi-Jews like the Samaritans. And then they even had to welcome Greeks, Romans, xenophilia. And in the process, they were changed. Sorry, I just had a little glitch here. How do we do this? How do we open ourselves? How do we actually achieve this kind of xenophilia? To help, I've created this little graphic. You see that little orange reddish horizontal line? It represents variation. The further right you go, the more varied is the group. The yellowy goldy one going up and down, the vertical, that's cohesion or integration. The higher up you go, the more integrated and into the central life of the community are all of the people. So intercultural is up in the top right because it's highly diverse, but it's also highly integrated, cohesive. In the lower right can be a community that's diverse, but not cohesive. The people aren't really integrated into the full life of the community. For instance, the power structure. In the upper left is a healthy, integrated, monocultural community. There's not much diversity, but there's high integration. And the lower left, well, that's a fragmented monocultural community. Where folk share the same culture, but they're fragmented, atomistic. And so to become intercultural, you have to go further along both of these lines, both axes. You have to increase the variation. Yes, that's the external part. But also you have to increase the connectivity, the integration. Open the heart of the community, the system, to welcome all. And well, opening sideways, well, that kind of makes sense, you know, increasing the variation. So let's instead focus on the vertical, because without that, then the varied folk who show up, the newcomers, the strangers, will not stay. They'll either slowly or quickly drift away. Next. So we want to look at the internal stuff. How do we do that? And if we want to do that, we need to help our brains out a bit. Next. And next. Ah, there it is. Our brains have to simplify what our eyes and ears take in. They have to simplify and generalize. It's critical. You see, the brain has trillions. It says 10 to the 12th, whatever that is. I don't know. Of specialized cells, and they do all kinds of wonderful things. But that prefrontal cortex, the part that does what we think of as thinking, it's rather puny in comparison. At the risk of boring you utterly, I'll quote from a book on the physics of the brain by a guy named Werner Lowenstein. What is normally rendered by the brain is thus an incomplete picture. It is a picture with a bias etched by age-old evolutionary processes for survival. Every fiber of the brain computer, every piece of hardware carries this bias. But while input is systematically distorted, those distortions are not carved in stone. They are malleable. Distorted but malleable. It kind of feels like that could be my family motto. So how does the brain organize gazillions of cells? It does it through neighborhoods. Neurons with similar or related functions are grouped together and interconnected so the messages can travel really, really fast, almost immediately, without needing to go through that thinking part, the prefrontal cortex. You know, that part that allows us to reason and be self-aware. It's very tiny, and it has very limited processing power compared to other areas. For example, if someone asks you to add 2 plus 2, you can do it quickly because you're drawing from memory. But if they ask you to divide 337 by 83, your response time is much slower because you're drawing on your computing power. Stereotypes and biases operate the same way. They make it quicker for our brains to react. So say you're meeting with, this happened to me, so say you're meeting with 10 people from another culture and 8 of them are talking at the same time. It's easier for your brain to label them as rude or crazy than to sit down with someone from the group and ask them to explain how they can concentrate and hear each other with multiple voices speaking at once. Labeling is quicker, more energy efficient, instant diagnosis. Imagine what would happen if you're driving a car and a child darts in front of your car and you had to engage the thinking part of your brain. Okay, I'm seeing a child running in front of the car now. What do I remember to do? Oh yes, I should brake. No, you brake immediately. It's the same thing that allows Connor Hallebuck to catch those pucks. Biases are just shortcuts our brains take to protect us. We depend on stereotyping. Those shortcuts. Research has found barrelfuls of biases working away unnoticed in our brains across all cultures. It's an automatic decision-making tool. Scientists say we're exposed to something like 11, I don't know how they measure this, but 11 million pieces of information at any one time. And our brains, that frontal area, can process 40. 40. The pre-established shortcuts, the biases, all those things help us navigate through this. So we immediately sort the 11 million bits of information out and reduce them to 40, and that's what we see. That's what we perceive. And then, of course, we believe the 40 is actually what's real. Quickly distinguishing friend from foe was essential for our survival. A false positive is always better than a false negative. If you are Wilma Flintstone, for example, and you run because you think you're being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, only to find out it was just Barney Rubble's pussycat, well, that's a lot safer than assuming it is Barney's pussycat and getting eaten by the saber-tooth. Implicit bias. Next. Studies of death rates in the sort of normal scale hurricane death rates, hurricanes, found that death rates in hurricanes with female names were twice as high as death rates in hurricanes with male names. And the more feminine the name, in quotes, the higher the death toll. Why? Because inside our brains, there's an unconscious association of femininity with something less violent, more gentle. People weren't preparing enough. Unconscious bias. On the screen, you can see less than 15% of American males are over 6 foot. Yet 60% of male CEOs are over 6 foot. Less than 4% are over 6'2". And yet over 36% of male CEOs are over 6'2". Now, it would be absurd to choose a CEO because of height. It's just an unconscious bias. Just as it would be absurd to give our employees lower performance evaluations if they're overweight, or for a teacher to call more often on boys with their hands up than girls. It's unconscious bias. Now, biases, interestingly, aren't that hard to change. Often it involves little more than bringing it to conscious awareness. Once an interview team becomes aware of the height bias, they're far less likely to be controlled by it. Next. It's how our brain is arranged. What's connected to what? What's near each other? If I am viciously attacked by a man wearing a green plaid suit, then somewhere in my hippocampus, which stores long-term memories and connects learning and emotions, green plaid becomes associated with pain and fear. Sometime later in life, when I'm approached by someone wearing a similar green plaid t-shirt, I may start to feel anxious and not even know why. See, the hippocampus is located very near the amygdala, and that is our fear center that activates our fight or flight freeze response. They instantly communicate and boom. Early on, I once took a bunch of refugees recently arrived from a war zone to a fireworks display. You can imagine. There isn't time here to explore all these biases, but I encourage you, if you're interested in helping your community open up, to do some reading in this and explore it online. There's some really important things like in-group bias, where the sense that somehow your group is best and others inferior, or the out-group homogeneity bias, where we tend to think of all members of a group culture as being the same, like all Filipinos like to take pictures. There's so many more, so dig, explore. Next. Yeah. Privilege is, by definition, something that not everybody has. One group has it because another doesn't. It's an accident of birth. It just happens you're born into it. Privilege is what happens when you're born into whatever group is on top in your society. And who has that privilege depends on context. For folk in Nepal, I learned, the Brahmin caste has privilege. The untouchables are denied it. North America, of course, and Europe, it's the white people, Europeans, settlers. If you wonder whether you have it, you probably do. If you didn't, you'd know it. It would be in your face constantly. Privilege exists in all of our churches as well. When a visitor sits in Fred and Gertie Anderson's place, where they normally sit, and the Andersons huff and puff and comment away, it's privilege. By itself, it's not necessarily dangerous. My colleague Damber once asked me, what did you do with your privilege as a white person working with us? I had to think for a moment. And then I realized I didn't deny it or downplay it. I didn't feel guilty about it or try to get rid of it. I tried to use it intentionally to benefit the community. Everyone has bias, and it's pretty easy to change. Not everyone has privilege, and it's difficult to change. But it's when unconscious bias combines with privilege that there's real danger, for then we can do great harm. Next. There are many other things. As we try to move along the horizontal axes, as we increase the diversity, the variation, we need to understand each other. Understand the other as an other rather than a slightly defective form of me or us. Fortunately, there's many tools that can help us. One of the most important areas of this comes out of the cross-cultural research of some years ago with Hofstede and others. And I Google him or go to that website, because in that, I think the most important starting place is understanding the difference between collectivist thinking, which is about 92% of the world, and individualist thinking, which is about 8% of the world. The central idea is, what's the basic unit, the most important? For collectivists, it's the group, the collective. For individualists, it's the individual. I know a young man in his early 20s, a newcomer, who feels a call to ministry. Though he perceives a call, community is saying, no, not yet. And their wishes prevail, and for him, there's no conflict inside him. The ideal for collectivists is a self fully absorbed in the collective. For individualists, it's a highly differentiated self. Group harmony is the most important. Relationships trump task. Take, for example, if you can imagine a good church board meeting, I know that's a stretch, but try to, an individualist would say, oh, it was great. Only an hour long, and we stuck to the agenda. We got all the business done. A collectivist, oh, it was good. Took a long time because at first we didn't all agree, but everyone got a chance to speak and speak as often as they needed to. And in the end, everybody felt heard. We only had time for that one piece of work, that decision, but we agreed to meet next week. How will those two groups find common ground? That's where cross-cultural information and insights can help. Some cultures, direct communication. Some cultures, indirect. If you are a direct communicator trying to understand somebody who is an indirect communicator, you may not get what they mean. And they may think of you as actually quite rude. Learning how others communicate is as important as learning what they communicate. How we deal with authority, personal space, it's all the same. Another quick tool that you can use in a community when you're helping people to try to understand next is called NAIL. When you see a behavior or something happens and you don't understand it, just follow NAIL. Notice it. Oh, I notice that's happening. Accept it. I accept that this is happening. Inquire, ask the person or an elder or somebody from the community, what does that mean? And then learn. Finally, and I just want to look, it's very helpful for a community to be able to, go to the levels of welcome. There are different levels of welcome, and it can be very helpful for a community for them to be able to articulate or begin to, how much welcome do they want to create? So there are different levels, and they're outlined there. You know, you can start with unwelcome or intolerant. We don't want you here. Or a grudging tolerance. It's a free country. You can be here. Or pleasant tolerance. I'll be nice to you if you behave. Conditional welcome. We'll accept you into our church or community if you're trying to be Canadian. Unconditional welcome goes a little bit further. We welcome you just as you are to be a part of our community, just as we are. That's where a lot of these tools stop. But for us, in our experience, it was the next level, transformational welcome. We welcome you just as you are into deep relationship with us, knowing in the process we will both be changed. What works for you? What would you be open to? What do you feel called to? So I invite you to take a few moments and just talk in groups together for a moment.
So, Bill, we have, let's see, 8 more minutes left. I would like to suggest, what if just we leave this space open for the whole group, for the large group to discuss and talk through the chat box, and you could reply those questions.
Okay.
But you get to choose what you prefer to do.
Sure, that sounds good.
Yeah. Right. So feel free to ask him, Bill, questions or comments, and Bill and I will do our best to pick some of the questions and reply as we go. But Bill, first of all, someone asked me, what's the difference between multicultural and intercultural model? Can you briefly explain that?
Yeah, you know, I don't use that difference because it changes in different contexts. In England, for example, or in many places in Australia, I believe as well, multicultural means something that closer to what we might consider intercultural. I think it's a question of semantics more than anything. My difference where I would define it as differently is intercultural is what happens in the spaces between people. It's more like jazz, it's fusion, it's the energy that happens in the spaces in between rather than two individuals or cultures sort of being side by side. It's rather than parallel play, it's social play. So it's, for me, that would be how I would define it, but there are others who would define it differently. So I'm a little careful with that difference, drawing too much difference there.
Let's see. There's a comment from Diane, and it says, I appreciate the idea of working at cohesion to be/become intercultural. Are there tools for helping to do that?
Yeah, there are tools. There's the training programs offered by Phil. I'm also in the process of finishing up and doing a series of podcasts that will be called Open Out. And they should start being rolled out at the end of the month, and you can find them at openout.ca once it gets up and going. But yeah, there are many resources. There are many places where you can access training, and there's a huge amount of stuff online. If you check under bias, if you just start exploring and reading, it really is saying, but I think the key thing is saying, whose responsibility is it to be a good and true host? And if it's ours, then we engage intentionally in the process of allowing ourselves to be changed. And that means we seek knowledge, we look and we try to understand, and we begin to understand that different cultures react differently to different situations. The sense of time is very different, so forth.
I know some of you are asking if can we have those the PowerPoint slides right after the webinar. We'll compile all the resources and send them out through email. So you'll have everything what we have
here. I noticed that the, I think it was from Gareth, that challenge, one of the challenges in a community is when we are in different places as a community. And that's not easy. You see, some people find change very, very, very threatening. And so one of the things that can help people in that context is relationships. So slowly building trusting relationships can help those who find the idea of opening outwards, intentionally opening outwards, to be very frightening. There may be good reasons why that person is frightened. They may be holding on to something that's very important to them. But it is being able to be as a community together and yet not have the most reluctant voices as the ones who determine the pace. We need to be sensitive and caring and loving, but not let that necessarily determine our direction.
I'm reading from another one person commenting and asking, is it a problem if we consider ourselves the host? Are we holding the power in the relationship?
Well, if it's your church, you know what? You do right now. The question is, what do you do with it later? Can you create space in your power and in your system so that those who come into your community can not only graft on and as additions, but can actually become fully integrated and become a part of your community, so integral that in fact your community is now a different community. And then that power is now a shared power. But in the beginning, I think it's important to recognize, yeah, in the beginning we do have it, we do hold it.
All right, and this will be our last question. We only have 2 more minutes. It's from Laurie, who said, any hints on how to build cohesion in a diverse congregation?
You know, like, this is when love, it goes a long way. you know, if we actually have an attitude of love, it covers a multitude of mistakes. We can be very effective. If we don't have love, it's not going to do us a lot of good. And even if we're clumsy, but we're very loving, you know, it's not the best thing, but it certainly goes a long way. I think a passionate intention to be loving, which is much stronger than just liking, that goes an awful long way. It's not complicated, but yeah, I think so.
Any last comment, Bill, before we close up?
No, I think that I think we're probably good.
Yeah. Well, I would like to invite the rest of the participants to keep on asking questions. Bill said that he will try to answer to your question within 48 hours. We don't want to overburden him, but feel free to comment and send out your questions as much as you want.
I'm just going to add, because it's a little bit larger than I anticipated, I'll commit within a week. I'll hope within 48 hours.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Bill, for facilitating this wonderful webinar, and thank you all for participating. This is our second in a series of webinars being offered by the Forum for Intercultural Leadership and Learning. In April 2020, we'll have another webinar, and the topic will be conflict and power dynamic among first generation and second generation churches. If you have a webinar topic that you want us to offer, please let us know. And if you're interested to facilitate a webinar, please let us know as well. And lastly, if you want to sign up for our e-newsletter and learn more what Phil does, leave your contact information in the chat box or simply email me. Wherever you are, have a great afternoon or evening. Shalom.
Tabashi.